Hi, this is Shauna here for Umbra EDU. The topic of this video is academic integrity, but more specifically, the tools that we use to promote it in our classrooms. As online learning has taken off over the past decade and is now hyper-accelerated by the COVID-19 pandemic, a host of new technologies have cropped up intended to help us ensure the integrity of our course assessments. Foremost in popularity among these new tools are lockdown browsers and remote proctoring. As the trend towards more online course offerings seems to show little signs of abatement, and as we grapple with unique academic integrity concerns emergent in the digital age, it seems appropriate to pair the growing popularity of new technologies with a critical reflection concerning their use, as well as the intentions which have inspired them. This video hopes to help instigate a much broader critical engagement with the use of new technologies being developed to better facilitate academic integrity.
What's the draw to develop and use new technologies to catch academically dishonest behavior? Well, the clearest impetus is that cheating is indeed a thing. According to the International Center for Academic Integrity, of 71,000 polled undergraduates, 39% admitted to having cheated on tests and 62% on written assignments. That's arguably the most obvious challenge to academic integrity imaginable. The steady expansion of online course offerings adds another unique layer of complexity to the matter of academic dishonesty, like cheating and plagiarism. Lockdown browsers and remote proctoring were developed to confront this complexity and offer solutions to academic dishonesty in the internet age. But how do they work? Well, let's start with lockdown browsers. In an online environment, students are using electronic devices to take assessments, which presents unique opportunities to engage in academic misconduct. In the case of exams, for example, students have the ability to have open multiple applications or browser windows simultaneously. So, while taking a multiple choice test on one internet browser tab, they might be Googling answers on another. Or they may have opened an electronic copy of their notes for easy reference while they take the exam. Lockdown browsers intervene by curtailing the functionality of a test taker's computer. Generally, the idea is that the only thing a student is capable of doing on their computers is complete an assigned assessment while the lockdown browser is engaged. That means no multiple browser tabs can be open, no other applications can be utilized, no Googling the answers, and no digital copies of notes. While that addresses at least some of the academic integrity concerns presented by computers as the principal tool of online learning, it leaves open others. Namely, that no matter how locked down a student's computer might be, the nature of remote assessments means we cannot control the environment in which students take exams. If a student is taking an exam at home with a lockdown browser, in other words, what's to stop them from pulling out handwritten notes to give them an unfair edge? How about a calculator or a phone? Hint, not a lockdown browser. Remote proctoring technology is intended to fill that gap by monitoring the test-taking environment. Often scalable in the degree of surveillance of the testing environment, remote proctoring essentially functions like the test proctoring we're all used to, by observing students taking exams, typically by using a student's in-computer webcam. These technologies may be as simple as recording the full duration of a student taking an exam so instructors can watch video capture at a later time, to sophisticated systems that use artificial intelligence bots that flag potentially erratic behavior of students. Some services offer the ability to observe students in real time as they take exams.
Lockdown browsers and remote proctoring are complementary technologies which can be employed in tandem. Both are fundamentally aimed at the same objective, to enhance the integrity of assessments. Developers of both technologies often put it more bluntly. They're designed to prevent cheating. It's worth noting that their complementarity is a function of how they seek to bolster academic integrity. At root, both achieve their aim by a presumptive relationship between surveillance, control, and the probability of being caught. The logic of these systems, crudely put, is that instructors can control the testing environment by closely monitoring it, and that close monitoring increases the likelihood that academic dishonesty will be detected and punished in kind.
Though not cited by the companies that develop them, there is a body of research which might provide a firm basis for this sort of honesty through surveillance thinking. Multiple studies have established that a key predictor of whether collegiate cheating will occur are students' perceptions of the likelihood of getting caught as well as the consequences. As Linda Nilsson puts it in her widely popular teaching handbook, quote, "Another critical perception by students who cheat is the opportunity to cheat. The lower the chances of getting caught, low supervision, and the lower the sanctions for getting caught, low threat, as students size up their odds, the more prevalent cheating is. So not surprisingly, the behavior is related to class size and the use of multiple choice tests." End quote. Such research fits neatly into a microeconomic model of decision-making wherein students are assumed to be rational individual actors. In a 2006 study, Patricia Hutton adopts microeconomic explanations explicitly, arguing that, quote, "Cheating is the result of an optimizing decision in which the benefits of cheating outweigh the costs," end quote. Similar assumptions appear to suffuse much peer-reviewed work on academic dishonesty. By the terms of this thinking, students' self-interested cost-benefit analyses determine whether or not they will cheat. If students perceive they are unlikely to get caught, or that the attendant consequences of being caught are low, then they are likelier to cheat. Conversely, when the likelihood of being caught is high and or the consequences of being caught are significant, students are less likely to cheat. Reverse engineering this logic, research following a microeconomic explanatory model moves to recommend that the problem of cheating appears to hinge on augmentations of students' perceived risk-reward ratios. Prudence in this case takes the form of a two-pronged strategy: increase an instructor's ability to detect cheating and create course policies with stringent punishments for transgressors. The ramifications of this thinking is not easily overestimated, as it now passes as best practice advice. Linda Nilsson again. Quote, "Except for your instructor status, the crucial determinants of cheating are within your control. So you can stop or at least drastically reduce academic dishonesty in your classes with proven prevention measures. Most of these either make cheating more difficult or heighten students' perceived chances of getting caught and facing dire consequences. And the rest reduce students' motivation to cheat." End quote. At a glance, this all seems to check out. Doing whatever necessary to ensure that cheaters never profit upholds our commitment to academic integrity. If that means deploying AI to surveil our students or control their personal technology, so be it.
Despite there being an evidentiary basis for honesty through surveillance tech, the rising popularity of this technology warrants critical reflection on its relative merits. As a start, most of the focus at present is trained on the purported efficacy of these technologies, though there does not appear to be robust research conducted on whether or not they achieve their stated goal of curbing cheating. There is certainly room, then, for healthy skepticism about the supposed merits of honesty through surveillance. As we noted, software developers don't cite a firm basis in research for their product's utility. Relevant literature does seem to exist, however, in studies that utilize microeconomic logic to explain the motives behind collegiate cheating. But the microeconomic model is only one of several rival explanatory models. Other research points to personal traits being a key predictor of students' willingness to engage in academically dishonest behavior. This rival branch of research effectively undermines the core assumption of the microeconomic model, that students are self-interested, rational actors who choose to cheat based on the results of a cost-benefit analysis. That's no small challenge to a strong case in favor of honesty through surveillance technology. The microeconomics-inspired branch of research could be seen as the evidentiary linchpin of the honesty through surveillance logic. If the reasons that lead students to cheat have more to do with personality traits than they do with rational calculus, then augmenting risk-reward ratios for cheating ends up looking less effective as a strategy for ensuring academic honesty.
Still, other research concludes that the single most robust predictor of whether students will engage in academically dishonest behavior is how their peers perceive such behavior. The fear of peer disapproval seems to better correlate with a student's willingness to cheat than self-interested cost-benefit analyses. But that evidence squares with the honesty through surveillance model, doesn't it? If students know they're likely to get caught and punished for cheating, they're not going to encourage their friends to cheat, are they? If anything, they would likely discourage them, surely. Maybe, but also maybe not. That logic effectively entangles individual sanctions with social norms in such a way that the former is presumed to be an effective means of shaping the latter. We can turn to two examples of where this logic was mobilized, but with very different effects. One example follows economist Robert Frank's explanation of the effect of tobacco use taxes in the United States. According to Frank, raising the costs to individual tobacco users in the U.S. in the form of additional taxes reduced total tobacco use over time. As the taxes were instituted, some existing tobacco users suddenly found their habits too expensive to continue, and the heightened costs dissuaded some would-be tobacco users from ever beginning a habit. For Frank, the crucial change, however, was the social function of the increased taxes. For each tobacco user who stopped, or would-be user who never started, there was a social grouping with one fewer tobacco user. The depletion of social groups of individual tobacco users steadily weakened the role of peer acceptance and modeling on the use of tobacco in aggregate. But another example might also be derived from the U.S. war on drugs policies. The centerpiece of the war on drugs has been the steady intensification of monitoring for narcotics sales and use, and an equally steady increase in the punitive costs to drug sellers and users. For all the increases in the U.S. government's capability and success at detecting and punishing the trade in narcotics, the policy effects have been nothing like the success story of tobacco use taxes. The war on drugs, instead, has become shorthand for policy failure and unintended consequences run amok. In the tobacco example, denuding the entanglement between costs levied against individuals and peer-to-peer modeling or influence resulted in the reshaping of social norms and behavior. But in the war on drugs example, individual cost-benefit analysis and social norms do not seem to be similarly entangled. The costs now levied against narcotics users and sellers are many, many times more severe than the costs to tobacco users. And yet, alarming numbers of drugs are sold and used in the United States. Following these two examples, it's not necessarily clear that doubling down on surveillance strategies will reliably result in the desirable reformation of social norms about academic dishonesty among students. At the very least, without further research to bolster our confidence that we can use individual threats and penalties to curb academically dishonest behavior at a social level, we should be especially sensitive to the potential for negative, unintended consequences to students for following this strategy.
So, there is clearly more than one way to understand why students cheat, which might weaken our confidence in the efficacy of honesty through surveillance. What isn't abundant is robust evidence that they are effective strategies to curb academic dishonesty. Most questions of efficacy are silently left to conjecture and inference. But conjecture and inference can be made to cut two ways. Take lockdown browsers for a moment. From one view, it makes a lot of sense. If students can't use the same computer on which they're taking an assessment to use back-channel sources of information to give them unfair advantage, then that's a huge win for the integrity of the assessment, right? Well, yes and no. The truth is that with a lockdown browser, a student can't use that computer to access back-channel information. But is that the only device they have access to? According to Pew Research Center, a third of U.S. households have multiple internet-connected smartphones. Another Pew study points to 71% of the poorest households in America having at least one smartphone in them. Those devices, they're not covered by a lockdown browser. So what are we expecting to play out?
Hello, Alex. Do you know the answer to that question? Guess what? I do. Can you afford not to know the answer? That question is 2.9% of the test grade. What if you get it wrong? What about the other answers? Are you sure? I know the answers to everything. You need me. Yes. That's it. We'll be happy together.
So it's possible to conclude that lockdown browsers offer a false sense of security vis-a-vis academic integrity.
Not at all for nothing. But it's also possible to detect a nucleic classism in the use of lockdown browsers as a strategy to detect cheating. That Pew Research study we just mentioned, the one where 71% of poor households have a smartphone in them, the flip side of that coin are the 29% of poor households without a smartphone in them. While there are other sorts of devices that could be used to back-channel information during an exam, it seems a stretch to believe that poor households without a smartphone would contain, say, an iPad. What that sets up is a situation in which more affluent students who have access to multiple internet-connected devices might perform better as a result of cheating than their poorer classmates who had no such access. Let's be clear, though. That's not an appeal to ensure equality of opportunity to engage in academically dishonest behavior. The point is that integrity problems can further disadvantage already disadvantaged students by deepening disparities in academic performance outcomes. Okay, so maybe lockdown browsers aren't a perfect solution. But that still leaves remote proctoring. Someone, or something in the case of AI bots, watching you take an exam. The Matrix, anyone? Would theoretically nullify the advantage of having multiple internet-connected devices. Though possible, it's far from certain. I don't know about you, but my students have been really sly about using cell phones while I'm right there watching. This is hypothetically where remote proctoring shines. Some remote proctoring services boast detection capabilities that would identify secondary devices like a cell phone. They can also verify a student's identity, monitor changes in typing speed, the number of voices in a testing environment. Seriously, is this the Matrix? No, it's a panopticon, like the Matrix, but a scholarly edition. At present, there isn't a great deal of empirical research available on the efficacy of remote proctoring. What does exist casts a long shadow of doubt as to how ultimately effective this technology is. Among the more focused studies that are currently available is a 2014 article by Karim, Kaminsky, and Behrend. They sought to establish preliminary evidence concerning how well what they term archival remote proctoring, where a student is video recorded during an exam for later review, prevents cheating. Their results showed that those who were told to record themselves taking an exam were less likely to cheat than those who were not. Proctored participants also showed no significant stress-related performance decrease. So, clear winner remote proctoring, right? Well, not quite. Study participants were also more likely to be dissatisfied with the assessment process. They consistently complained about privacy concerns. And the study does raise questions about its representativeness. Study participants in this case were not in fact students, but monetarily compensated workers recruited via a private corporate network. At present, the literature positions remote proctoring as, at best, a flawed hero to the shortcomings of lockdown browsers. And the flaws are well worth elucidating.
Karim, Kaminsky, and Barrand also hint at an element of our wrangling with academic integrity in the digital age that deserves front billing. Namely, what do students think about all of this? Most of the research that undergirds the honesty through surveillance model of upholding academic integrity only indirectly includes a student perspective. It filters students' perceptions through narrow questions intended to unearth why they cheat, or don't. That research has, in its turn, upheld somewhat dogmatic suggestions in teaching and learning best practices. As we've seen, top texts advance the honesty through surveillance model of academic honesty, justifying that approach by reliance on a microeconomic understanding of why students engage in academic dishonesty of all sorts. That, in its turn, offers justification for the creation of a multifaceted digital architecture for enhancing instructors' ability to more closely surveil their students. None of this spares concern or thought for students' perceptions of the technology they're being subjected to. All of the focus is retained on molding student behavior as effectively as possible. What gets missed is any sense of how they feel about how we're trying to mold their behavior, and the possible implications thereof.
What does seem clear is that students aren't tremendous fans of the honesty through surveillance approach. Karim, Kaminsky, and Barrand found it in their 2014 study. So too are university administrators. A Texas Tech administrator notes in a 2017 Inside Higher Ed article of their pilot remote proctoring program, quote, "A lot of the comments we received were about being intrusive in their lives, that someone was watching them the whole time they were being proctored," said Justin Lauder, Associate Vice Provost, Worldwide E-Learning at Texas Tech, noting students often take exams in their dorms or bedrooms. Quote, "They thought it was Big Brother invading their computers," end quote. Student grudges against honesty through surveillance technology, in many respects, mirrors worker responses to similar technological innovations adopted by private corporations. Indeed, there is unambiguous evidence that when instituted in corporations, honesty through surveillance technology has broadly negative influences on workers' perceptions of the company, job satisfaction, organizational commitment, perceptions of fairness, anti-organizational behaviors, and a more hostile working environment. Why would we expect college students to be any less dissatisfied with being surveilled than our business employees? And while the literature on employee performance monitoring, the corporate term for what we're calling honesty through surveillance, has found reliable ways to mitigate some of the most adverse reactions from employees, it's not clear that seeking to repurpose those best practices for higher education is a wise decision.
Why? Well, it's all in the name. The principal logic behind electronic performance monitoring is the enhancement of employee performance. It's seen as a means to promote workers working better, at least in principal part. The purpose of near-identical technologies in higher education is not performance, it's integrity. The point is to enhance the integrity of the assessment process used to measure student learning. That's a crucial point of divergence. The point of one is to encourage people to be more effective and efficient. The other, to keep them honest. But there is clear and unambiguous evidence that both technologies come at a common cost: the dissatisfaction of those subject to increased surveillance. Leaving aside comparisons for a moment, such costs start to look Pyrrhic quickly in the context of higher education. There is no evidence that we're making students better students by compelling them to use lockdown browsers and remote proctoring, strictly speaking. Just more honest. What is certain is that we're increasing their dissatisfaction with the learning process to which they are subject. And that dissatisfaction is likely to range beyond their perceptions of assessment protocols.
If the far-reaching perceptional impacts of EPM technologies for employees are any indication, it's not unreasonable to believe that students may end up with strong feelings about more than just the use of honesty through surveillance strategies in their classes. Seeing these technologies through students' eyes, it's not hard to understand how they can introduce a foundational sense of distrust into the student-instructor relationship. It could also sow discontent, which affects how positively or negatively students view the course and its contents as a whole. Depending on how deep that dissatisfaction and distrust runs, the use of honesty through surveillance tech may well subvert the ultimate goal of student learning.
Student satisfaction is an important variable to be aware of, as it is intimately connected with how well students are learning. As Joshua Eyler argues in his popular text, How Humans Learn, learning experiences characterized by happiness, broadly defined, aids students in both the retention of the knowledge of instructors are trying to impart and aids them in grasping the broader relevance of what they're learning for their lives in general. In fact, he presses this point a great deal further. Quote, "Without question, though, the research on positive emotions and learning reveals that the single most important strategy we can use to help our students to succeed in our courses is to care about them as learners and as human beings." End quote. What's more is that the perceived indifference of instructors towards students as people seems to have a clear correlation to students' willingness to engage in academically dishonest behavior.
So, if given the current state of empirical research, we know that 1. The point of honesty through surveillance isn't to make students better students. 2. That though we might be succeeding in upholding the integrity of our assessments, we are certainly increasing student dissatisfaction. And 3. Their dissatisfaction could well be undercutting their learning. Then the question must be begged. Are we barking up the wrong tree? The answer would be a resolute no if there existed no reliable alternative way to assess our students than conventional summative assessments. In such a case, the best option for both their learning as well as the integrity of measuring that learning would be to double down and determine how best to mitigate the risks of utilizing honesty through surveillance strategies. But the answer really is that there are other ways of assessing our students. Ways, in fact, that circumvent the need for surveillance altogether, or at least grossly diminish them. Surely, student satisfaction and happiness shouldn't determine every aspect of how we teach or of how we assess our students. Yet given their close correlation to the quality of their learning, we should be attentive to the potential points of tension between our assessment designs and their satisfaction and happiness.
There are several other good reasons to consider seeking alternative strategies to upholding academic integrity. 1. Would you rather devote time to setting up and explaining surveillance technologies to your students, probably even helping troubleshoot them during assessments? Or would you rather spend that time thinking through lesson plans that communicate course materials? There is an unspoken opportunity cost to instructors for using surveillance software for their assessments, and it comes in the form of time they could otherwise be spending on more content-relevant work. 2. Promoting equality at the institutional level. As we've already mentioned, there is a looming classist element sewn into the use of third-party developed softwares at the student level, namely that it might facilitate detection of poorer students at disproportionate rates than more well-to-do students. But it might also drive inequality in other ways. It's not clear that lockdown browsers and remote proctoring are affordable for all institutions, at least not without increasing technology or general use fees. With the cost of college already pushing the limits or beyond them for students, should we really be raising the financial stakes further?
So, where does all this leave us? Well, as with any critical exercise, probably with a few more questions than we had at the outset. Maybe the most pressing of them is, what's the most productive way forward? We submit that charting the most productive way forward is to trace this whole topic upstream as far as we can. The vital tributary of the topic is a particular conception of academic integrity. The concept of academic integrity, which lies at the heart of honesty through surveillance, is a fundamentally negative one. Integrity is measured in what students don't do. The simplified, but not wholly unfair argument is that integrity is the absence of misrepresentations of student learning. By conceiving integrity as defined through absences, we foreground preventive strategies as the most appropriate to the maintenance of it. The risk, as we have seen, is that an absence-centered concept of integrity leads us to adopt means for upholding it that are in tension with the ultimate objectives we as instructors strive for, namely, optimized student learning. Students balk at being strictly surveilled, and it's not hard to understand why. There is an undeniable dystopian undertone to the honesty through surveillance strategy. It really is 1984, Big Brother is watching to some extent. It may be for a noble purpose, but that's what Big Brother thought too. One way out of this impasse would be to reshape the definitional architecture of academic integrity. Instead of being conceived of as what students don't do, what if the central characteristic of integrity was what students can do? The subtle but profound trade would be this: that academic integrity not be conceived of as the absence of misrepresentation of student learning, but rather the presence of authentic demonstrations of student learning. Through this lens, a very different sort of course design terrain comes into view. It attunes instructors to think creatively about designing opportunities for students to authentically demonstrate what they've learned, rather than to design assessments wherein authenticity is strictly and necessarily bound to the absence of misrepresentation within their demonstrations. Such a shift would portend a number of advantages over absence-centered understandings of integrity. Possibly the most significant is the potential to enhance the durable lessons learned through participation in our courses. Irrespective of discipline, we as instructors hold in common the objective to help our students engage in learning which will benefit them beyond the bounds of our course. By beginning from a view of integrity as authentic demonstrations of learning and aligning our assessments with that concept, we encourage students to achieve the sort of learning outcomes which can be durably and sustainably demonstrated. Just because they didn't cheat on an exam or plagiarize a paper doesn't necessarily demonstrate that students achieved durable and sustainable learning that will benefit them in the long run. It's entirely possible to have accurately represented a high degree of learning for the purposes of an exam, only to rapidly forget what you learned. And I'm not speaking from experience. No, sir, not me. Moreover, this shifted conceptualization of integrity avoids the inherent risks of a conceptualization that privileges honesty through surveillance strategies. It enables instructors to more comprehensively facilitate a classroom culture built on mutual trust and support, to convince our students that our classes are networks in which they can feel seen and their learning cared about. As we discovered in the research, student perceptions of instructors' investment in them is enormously important.
And be assured, there are plenty of assessment designs whose integrity doesn't rely on surveillance. We've detailed some of these designs with the most interdisciplinary adaptability at umbraedu.com already, and we're developing new resources to facilitate their integration in your course, no matter what you're teaching. In the end, our most genuine hope is that this video helps to spur a broader conversation about academic integrity. There's so much room for further research and reflection. The stakes are simply too high to presume that widely accepted ways of thinking about what it means to have academic integrity are sufficient. If you've liked this video, please give us a like and subscribe. We've got new online teaching and learning content released every week. You can also follow us on Twitter or check out our website. We'll leave links in the video description below. This is Shauna Lesueur, checking out for Umbra EDU.